Well, first of all, I want to welcome everyone here, both in the room and on video. This has been a wonderful conference so far, and today we have two more interesting lectures this morning. The first one by John Lee, professor of history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he teaches courses on Achaemenid Persia and ancient Greece. He grew up in Asia and Hawaii, studied history at the University of Washington, and received his PhD in history from Cornell University. His publications include A Greek Army on the March, published by Cambridge University Press, The Persian Empire in the Great Courses series in 2012, and The First Black Archaeologist, The Life of John Wesley Gilbert by Oxford University Press just last year. He is a member of the managing committee on the American Schools of Classical Studies at Athens, and we are really delighted to have him here today. John.
Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Thank you, Raheem and Robert, for allowing me to join this really illustrious, exhilarating gathering of scholars. I feel honored to be here to play such a small role in this meeting, and also to meet this younger scholars and students who are the future of this field. I want to say hi as well to my 45 students in Achaemenid Persia at UC Santa Barbara, not all of whom are attending my lecture, but they have been attending by Zoom throughout this conference, and it's really amazing that we have that ability to let students attend remotely. My topic today is intimate relationships, family, and identity in the Achaemenid Empire. And this is part of my return, you might say, to Achaemenid studies after spending the better part of a decade working in African American history. And I think the pace of scholarship in those years has been bewildering. Even during this conference, we've heard about new publications coming out at this very moment. Nonetheless, I hope that I can make a small contribution. I've also, being last in the program, have the chance to take advantage of the previous papers and to reflect and think about how I might link together with those. I'm going to start in what might seem an unusual place, with the Soviet Union. My colleague Adrienne Edgar, in her new book, Intermarriage and the Friendship of Peoples, Ethnic Mixing in Soviet Central Asia, examines Kazakhstan and Tajikistan to see how the Soviet state both created a diverse ethnic national republic system and sought to unify the members of those republics within a single Soviet people. Following early Bolshevik nationality theory, these republics included both an identity component and a territorial component. And this Soviet emphasis on ethnic diversity even extended to language. In the 1930s, Soviet schools taught more than 70 different languages, although Russian became more emphasized in the later years of Stalin. Now, the Soviets celebrated mixed marriages as a sign of the friendship of peoples and the merging of nationalities. They promoted it as modern and international, although, of course, one ethnic group, ethnic Russians, continued to stand above the rest. There were foreign policy advantages. The reported high rates of Soviet intermarriage, always rising year after year in the official statistics, allowed the Soviets to score Cold War points against the United States and its racial segregation. Now, while the Soviets celebrated mixing, the state's official line stuck to the concept of one nationality per person. For every Soviet citizen had to choose a nationality at age 16 and carry a passport listing that single nationality. This is Leonid Brezhnev's. He was just easy to find a nice high-resolution image of a Soviet passport. Now, Adrienne was able, working in the modern period, to use oral history to examine the contradiction between the official Soviet lines and the lived experiences of mixed families, negotiating the everyday experiences of names, languages, rituals, and more. And of course, we can't do that, but for an Achaemenid historian, this concept of an empire created out of the unity of diverse peoples, with one people still at the top, has a certain resonance. We have only to look at the many lands and peoples in the empire's royal art and inscriptions, an empire containing all kinds of men, or many kinds of men, and the Vizpazana-ness of the empire, as Tavernier puts it, emphasized the unity and collaboration of all, guided by the the master hand of the king. Now, of course, the Achaemenid Empire was not the Soviet Union, and I think I bring this up because the most important thing about this comparison is to show the differences rather than the parallels between these imperial systems. For one thing, although Darius and the early Achaemenid court had a definite interest in maintaining Persianness, the Achaemenids has, as far as we can tell, no official mechanism for assigning or verifying membership in a specific ethnic group, no internal passports. For another thing, the Achaemenids were not influenced by the primordialist and biological views of ethnicity that began to shape Soviet thought in the 30s, and as Dan Potts showed us last time, shaped early interpretations of the Elamites. So my initial hope, inspired by Adrian, was to kind of do an empire-wide analysis. And Rolf asked, are you going to talk about Egypt? I tried. Zadok, Porton, I could reel off a list of names onomasic handbooks that I went through, but what I found was that people in the empire intermarried, and that no distinguishable pattern could be attached between names and ethnicities. And if you want to talk about some of these sources, whether they're Babylonian tablets, the sacred animal necropolis fragments, the Jedher Stele, which maybe Henry will talk about later. We can talk about that. But I ended up coming back to those barbarous western margins of the empire and those lying, thieving Yauna with their untrustworthy literary sources. Archaeology and epigraphy, of course, have revealed the multi-ethnic character of this region, as we have seen already in this conference. And to cite one example we haven't talked about, the sacrilegious inscription from Ephesus from late Achaemenid, early Hellenistic times, has Lydian, Greek, Iranian, and Carian names in onomastically mixed genealogies, which suggests linguistic interactions, but it doesn't actually prove intermarriages. So we still have to go back to the Greek sources and to a very familiar one, back to Herodotus. And here, Robert, you may already have written this exact same topic in the article, which is just coming out, and I have not yet seen. So these three are familiar, yet they're worth looking at again. The first from Macedon, from the end of the 500s, in which Herodotus, book 8, 136, he also mentions this in book 5, the king Amyntas of Macedon married his daughter Gygaea to the Persian Bubares. Bubares' father, Megabazus, had led the Persian conquest of Thrace and was satrap at Daskyleon. Now, some sources have Megabazus married to a daughter of Darius, making Bubares Xerxes' nephew. Amyntas died soon afterward, but this marriage created a connection that enabled the Persians to employ his successor, Alexander I, Gygaea's brother, as an emissary to Athens. And recently, Tom Harrison has made the very intriguing suggestion that the Herodotean story in which the Persian emissaries come to Macedon and grab at Macedonian women and get killed for it actually is a reworking of the reality of more extensive Persian-Macedonian intermarriage, literally rewriting the genealogy by ending it before it begins. Bubares and Gygaea had at least one son, Amyntas, named after his grandfather, and Herodotus notes that he received the city of Alabanda in Phrygia as a grant from the king. Probably more likely this is Alabastra in Hellespontine, Phrygia. And the descendants of Gygaea and Bubares could well have continued to hold territories in Anatolia long after that, meaning that mixed Persian-Macedonian people could have formed part of the elite of Hellespontine Phrygia from very early on in the empire's history. A second glimpse comes from Herodotus' narrative of the Athenian Miltiades, whose family established itself in the Chersonesus during the 500s BC. Miltiades married a Thracian princess, set himself up as a local ruler, and he served in Darius' Scythian expedition. But in 493, Phoenicians captured Miltiades, a son of Miltiades from another woman, not the Thracian wife. And when the Phoenicians brought Miltiades to Darius, thinking that they would be rewarded because of Miltiades' alleged role in sabotaging the Danube Bridge during the Scythian expedition, Darius instead did Miltiades no harm but much good, giving him a household or house oikos property katasis and a Persian wife, Persuda Gineka, who bore him children, who were in a verb that's occasioned a lot of discussion, who were ordered, reckoned, or honored as Persians. Now, this passage could well reflect some sort of official legal status of Persianness, but I doubt there was a satrap somewhere with a list who was making a list and checking it twice. I think it just as well reflects an acceptance of Miltiades' children and their descendants by his wife's relatives and the family network surrounding them. And thinking of another meaning of kosmeo, of adornment, it might also mean that they were given clothing or accessories, jewelry that identified them as Persians. How do you know I'm from Hawaii? Well, the shirt might be a clue, and a particular shirt at that. There's my visual teaching aid. So these stories reveal mixed marriages in the Aegean borderlands. They show them with an overtly political function, a way of creating links with people beyond the empire's borders, beyond the empire's direct control, I should say, and a way of incorporating potential troublemakers while also demonstrating the king's beneficence. Now, our third Herodotus passage involves the intimate relationship the Greeks call palakia. This is often translated as concubine, but these women could be high status and were not merely sexual objects. So I'm going to leave the term untranslated. After the Battle of Plataea, the Spartan commander Pausanias encountered a finely dressed woman who said she was the daughter of Hegetorides of Kos, and that, quote, "The Persian took me by force from Kos and kept me against my will," naming one Pharondates, son of Theaspis, who Herodotus elsewhere makes into the nephew of Darius. "Not to worry," says Pausanias, "if that's really who you are, I'll send you on your way," and he ends up doing so. There is both a Homeric echo here and a play-acting echo. She's calling him the king of Sparta, which he's not, and he is questioning whether she is, in fact, there against her will or not. Now, whether or not this woman actually was from Kos, or she actually had a connection with Pharondates, matters less than the category of relationship that this story reveals. Along the coast, non-Persian women were entering palakis relationships with Persians. Some of those relationships produced mixed descendants, and some of those people were incorporated into the empire's provincial elite. It's also, I think, a good reminder that the Achaemenid Empire, like all empires, inflicted violence and subjugation on its people. It wasn't especially remarkable in doing that. That's a feature of imperial power. Now, with the rise of the Athenian Empire as a regional competitor, this whole region experienced a great deal of internal strife, often centering on pro-Persian, pro-Athenian faction conflict in the Ionian cities. And this might have made mixed Persian and Greek marriages less likely, although some Greek leaders may have sought marriage alliances with provincial Persians, perhaps not with the chutzpah that Thucydides attributes to the Spartan Pausanias, that same Pausanias who allegedly wrote Xerxes proposing to marry the king's daughter so that I can make Sparta and the rest of Hellas subservient to you. This fluid situation may have increased the chances that Greek women, sometimes involuntarily, sometimes voluntarily, entered palakis relationships with Persians. They might become that way as war captives or hostages, political exiles, or even as free agents who sought to advance their own individual status. Plutarch tells us that Themistocles, as an exile, encountered the satraps Palakai at Sardis. Plutarch as well reports that in the court of Artaxerxes I in the 460s, that the Chiliarch Hazarapatish Artabanus had a woman partner from Eretria, a city the Persians had destroyed in 490 BC, before resettling some of its people near Susa. Whether she was wife or palakis is unclear, but her presence is striking at the very heart of the empire. And by the end of the 5th century, the young Persian prince Cyrus could openly include 2 Greek palakai in his entourage. That these women were visible and apparently well regarded by his Greek mercenaries suggests they may have played a political role in helping Cyrus gain support for his revolt. In another part of the anabasis, we might consider the situation of Ariaeus, who the Greeks offered the throne after the Battle of Cunaxa. Apparently Ariaeus spoke Greek well enough he did not need a translator, and his response was, well, there are many Persians who are Beltius, better than I, but Xenophon never explains what that means. And I think we might consider that one aspect of that might have been family relationships, that somewhere in his background Ariaeus had a Greek or a part Greek family member in Western Anatolia. The mainland Greek sources, on the other hand, show increasing hostility to intermarriage with barbarians. I think this tells us that such intimate relationships were a noticeable feature of this borderlands region. Chiron besieged Carian cities that had bilingual populations and Persian garrisons. The playwright Euripides used the term mixo-barbaros on the Athenian stage. The Spartan commander Lysander was supposedly very worried by the city's appearance by Ephesus when he arrived to see it thoroughly barbarized on account of mixing. And a few years later, he enslaved the people of Kedriae and Caria on the grounds that they were barbaroi. By the 4th century, Plato in the Menexenus would disparage Greeks who intermarry with others, in contrast to Athenians who are, quote, pure Hellenes and don't live as mixo barbaroi. Maybe the most interesting aspect of this is the citizenship law of Pericles in 451-0, which, although it did not ban intermarriage, restricted citizenship to those whose mother and father were free Athenians. Unlike the far-flung and decentralized Achaemenid Empire, the Athenian Empire, imperial state, if you want to call it that, was both small enough and possessed of enough institutional mechanisms, such as citizen lists, that it actually could enforce such a restriction. In this respect, it was a lot more like the Soviet Union than the Achaemenid Empire was. Now, in this last part of the talk, I'm going to focus on Deuskalion and the northwestern fringes of Hellespontine power. And I won't talk about the seal, we can discuss it. This is from Deuskalion, but imagine the complex identities involved in someone using a seal which shows a Yauna defeating another Yauna in a document that was sealed at this capital. Deuskalion had a large range of direct contacts with Greeks and other border peoples, and we can see this even in the family of Pharnaces and his descendants based at Deuskalion. And here I'm going to directly engage with John Hyland's work, and some of you may not know that John and I have been having these discussions for nearly 30 years, since he was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student. So I'm building on the really outstanding work that he has done. We know that this family had Palakis connections. Pharnaces, the satrap by the 430s and father of the famous Pharnabazos, had one son by a Palakis. You can see him there. Bagaios, in the Greek sources, call a nothos. Bastard brother is usually the translation, but I don't think that exactly captures his status, because he was high enough to be a cavalry commander. Pharnabazos himself had Palakai, possibly Greek, whom the soon-to-be satrap Mani of Dardanus cultivated as a way to get Pharnabazos' approval. And Xenophon also reports that in 395, Pharnabazos attempted to take the daughter of the onomastically Persian noble Spithridates without marriage, aneogamo, likely meaning as a Palakis. And this suggests that Persian women, too, onomastically Persian women, could be counted as Palakai. I don't have time here to talk about Ariobarzanes, the successor of Pharnabazos, and other members of the family. We could perhaps bring that up in the discussion, except to mention that Ariobarzanes worked closely with a Greek mercenary commander. He and his sons received Athenian citizenship, showing links across this frontier, and after revolting in the 360s, Ariobarzanes was betrayed and killed. So that brings us to Artabazos, the son of Pharnabazos, born around 390 BC. His mother was a daughter of Artaxerxes II, and I think maybe it may help to go back to this genealogical chart. Her name in Greek renders an Old Persian word, the last or the youngest, sometimes suggested to be a title, but there's no evidence that she had a different personal name. Artabazos was therefore part Persian and part Babylonian, for his paternal grandparents, Darius II and Parysatis, were the children of Artaxerxes I and two Babylonian women whom Cyrus calls Palakai. One with a Greek name probably derived from an Akkadian name, and another whose Greek name likely reflects a Babylonian theophoric name. Now, around 363, Artabazos got married. The orator Demosthenes, in a speech composed in 352, describes Artabazos' new wife only as the sister of two young Greek leaders, Mentor and Memnon. In the 1st century, Diodorus adds the ethnic Rhodian. Now here John has argued that Artabazos' marriage, was at its origins a hasty alliance meant to produce legitimate offspring and demonstrate the certainty of his family's future. I think this is a very plausible interpretation, but I'd like to extend this interpretation further. To start with the Rhodian toponymic, it's so familiar to us that it's easy to forget that what Rhodes was in the 4th century was still a work in progress. Ialissos, Kamaros, Lindos, some other small communities had only formally synoikicized, come together, in 408, and there was a lot of civil strife in the succeeding years as the city figured out who would be in charge. Moreover, Rhodes had strong Achaemenid connections. Extensive cultural contact is evident in the luxury metalware and glass found on Rhodes, which includes several imported silver fiali and numerous vessels emulating or adapting Achaemenid styles. There were Rhodian ships in Xerxes' fleet. In the late 400s, the Rhodian exile and Olympic champion Doriaeus commanded ships in the Hellespont, and he may even have had a stronghold or a base near Rhoeteon, northeast of Ilion. Rhodians joined Cyrus the Younger. In 395, the royal official Tithraustes sent Timocrates of Rhodes from Sardis on a major diplomatic mission to Greece. And meanwhile, the king's peace of 387-6 put Rhodes into the Achaemenid sphere, and the island came under Carian domination in the 350s. So, although the ethnic or the toponym of Rhodians has become attached to the family of Mentor and Memnon and the wife of Artabazos, we don't necessarily need to assume that this family came directly from Rhodes, that they were entirely, quote, Rhodian, whatever that means in the 4th century, or that they had any continuing link with the island. One of the odd things about Mentor and Memnon is their names are apparently absent from the more than 500 personal names recorded in the lexicon of Greek personal names from inscriptions from Rhodes from the 6th to 3rd centuries. Now that's not decisive, but it's quite interesting because instead they're both names associated with the Troad. In the Iliad, Imbrius, the son of Mentor, holds the site of Pedaeum or Pedasa. Memnon, the king of the Ethiopians, is a powerful ally. And interestingly, the Iliad also mentions a Rhodios river in the Troad, which Strabo says flowed to the sea between Abydos and Dardanus. Here's the name Mentor on a drachma from Abydos dating to the 350s. And it's worth noting that Artabazos' predecessor, Ariobarzanes, had drawn heavily on the support of one Philiscus of Abydos. Now, on the other hand, as John has pointed out in his recent article, numismatists have identified coins datable to the 350s that bear symbols of the unified polis of Rhodes. There's a bronze example there, the head of Helios and the rose, which they suggest were minted by Memnon or Mentor in the context of Artabazos' revolt against imperial power in the 350s. But I would wonder whether this does not tell us so much about an appeal to a specific ethnicity as the creation of a sort of personal badge associated with the family that was independent of any actual connection to Rhodes. Just as Jeffrey Spear talked last time about the increase in what have been interpreted by some as portraits of individual satraps. Now, I'll skip over some of this other material to end with my conclusion about the family. It's plausible to conclude then that Artabazos' wife and her brothers were part of the Greek military political diaspora scattered along the Aegean coast, arguably with a pre-existing territorial base in the Troad. It is even possible that the family already had Persian or part Persian intimate connections, which would make Artabazos' marriage much more explicable. On this reading, Artabazos' marriage was a strategic step up. Now, in the 350s, Artabazos and Memnon, but not Mentor, joined a revolt against Artaxerxes. This is so convoluted it will drive you mad to study it, so we'll skip the details. But the upshot is that Memnon and Artabazos and family spent some time in the court of Philip of Macedon, while Mentor made himself invaluable in Egypt and elsewhere as a commander for the empire, becoming close with an imperial official and rising to the highest levels of court. And his service enabled him to earn a pardon for Artabazos and Memnon in the 340s. Artabazos' daughter Barsine married her uncle Mentor to enhance, as John Hyland has argued, family solidarity, and possibly also a way of reintegrating the formerly rebellious part of the family into Mentor's loyal side. After Mentor died around 340, Barsine married Memnon, and Memnon, along with Thimondos, Mentor's son from an earlier marriage, played a leading role in the initial stages of the defense against Alexander's invasion. Now, Diodorus says Artabazos and his wife had 11 sons and 10 daughters. Some people have been skeptical, but Wikipedia, that reputable source, gives us a good dozen documented cases of European and North American couples between 1800 and 1900 having 20-plus children, and not all of them in multiple births. And Plutarch tells us that Barsine received a Greek paideia upbringing. Presumably her brothers and some of her sisters were also educated. Some assume this paideia resulted from being at Philip's court, but it's equally likely that their mother played a key linguistic and cultural role in their children's lives before they went into exile. So the Artabazos children therefore straddled the cultures of Persia and Greece, even though their names remain mostly Persian. And I think this is noteworthy because if all we had of these children were their names and patronymics, we would conclude that they were Persian, without knowing the narrative story behind them. About the famous Barsini, I think one outstanding question is the etymology of her name, because oddly, very little attention has been paid to her name since Yusti in 1895, and that would be something I would like to hear more from those of you who are expert in the linguistic angle. And I see my time is coming to a close. Of the other daughters, Artakama and Artonis, who you can see there at the right side, are named in various ways by the different sources, and people generally prefer Arrian's over Plutarch's versions of these names. Interestingly, both of them are Greek forms rendering Old Persian names from Arta, truth, which is among the most common elements of Achaemenid names. So if we're looking for something common in imperial naming, perhaps it's a name, an Arta name. If you don't know what to name your child, give him or her an Arta name in the empire. For Artakama, it's noteworthy that the other appearances of this name in Greek sources refer to men. In the Cyropaedia, Xenophon describes Artakamas as a king, whom Cyrus the Elder makes satrap in Greater Phrygia. In Anabasis, in a probably interpolated passage, Artakamas is the satrap set up by Cyrus the Younger in Phrygia. If Arrian didn't get his names wrong, the Phrygian link is tantalizing. Perhaps we have here a link or a hint of marriage links between neighboring satrapal families. The other Artabadza's boys, whose names we know, are all well-known Persian and family names. The one name we might comment on is Ariobarzanes, whose relative had died a rebel to the empire. So naming a son after this rebellious relative was perhaps a way of recuperating the name. Another son, Kofes or Kofen, has also never received much linguistic attention. Greek speakers might link his name with Greek kophos, mute or deaf or metaphorically quiet. There is a place named Kofane associated either with the modern Kabul River or a settlement in Arachosia, but as John suggested to me before the conference, a derivation from Old Persian Kaufa mountain might be most likely, and for someone part of a family living in the Troad, Mount Ida as a prominent physical and ritual site in the landscape might have provided some inspiration for that. The final son is the most intriguing, the final named son, and I'll end with him. Curtius writes that the wife of Artabazdas and her son, Ilioneus, were among the Persians captured after Issus in 333. Assuming that a mother and son must mean this boy is still a child, some people argue this was another wife of Artabazdas, but I don't think it is necessary to do that. I think we can reasonably place this son, Ilioneus, with the other sons of Artabazdas. There is one epigraphic appearance of Ilioneus in a Greek inscription, an Athenian inscription, but a much more important connection emerges if we look back to the Troad. Homer names the Trojan Ilioneus, the son of Phorbas, who dies a gruesome death at the hands of Peneleus of Boeotia. And we're reminded here again of the Homeric echoes of Mentor and Memnon. The name Ilioneus might be connected with Artabazdas' recapture of Ilion from the Athenian general Chares, and most importantly, such a name links well with the 4th century resurgence of Ilion and the sanctuary of Athena Ilias as a site for both Greeks and Persians. And Ellis Evans has recently identified a series of coins from the Troad that represent the cult statue of Athena Ilias on the reverse and a local deity on the obverse. What Ellis Evans suggests is an attempt by Persian authorities or Greek local Greeks, or both, to create a shared regional identity based on the worship of this goddess. Ilion in the 300s was, as Brian Rose reminds us, accessible to and utilized by both Greeks and Achaemenids. So as we come to an end, Ilioneus fittingly symbolizes the entangled identities created at the western margins of the Achaemenid Empire. The son of a Persian noble, related to the king no less, and a Greek or Rhodian woman, likely educated in both Greek and Persian fashion, whose father was an important general and satrap and a rebel who was redeemed and reaccepted in the empire, whose Greek uncles took leading roles in maintaining and defending the empire, and most fittingly bearing a name that both gestured towards a poem that defined the Hellenic identity, but also a religious sanctuary that both Greeks and Achaemenids employed. So what are the takeaways from my rather unsatisfying analysis? I think I would like to suggest at the very minimum, we recognize that intimate relationships occurred amongst Persians and non-Persians across the empire, beginning very soon after the conquest. We don't know how many they were, but some of these resulted in children of mixed heritage, meaning that over time, the dominant ethno-class became, in fact, more and more mixed, especially after the first generation or two of the empire. We must always recognize the possibility that behind an onomastically Persian, Iranian, or any other name lies someone of mixed experience. Persianness was different in 500, in 400, in 330. Out here in the Aegean borderlands, these mixed children could play key roles as intermediators, but their very existence also provided flashpoints for concerns about identity, and it enabled families like that of Artabadzas to easily move back and forth across the borderlands divide. So in that sense, these families could be both integrative and centrifugal. Intimate relations helped bind together the empire, but too many local connections could lead to the fraying of control at the margins of imperial power. Thank you.